Right, John, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I think you've got a very fascinating background and story, including your memoir, Quest, to which I had the opportunity to have a look at. And something that really jumped out to me was this sense of adventure that you've always had. And as you've shared with me, at times it was misplaced, but then at other times you've been able to find meaning behind your own sense of adventure. And now all the work you're doing in the Giraffe Heroes Project. So I'm sure we will get an opportunity to delve into all of that. But before we get started, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and who you are.
It's it, how do I? Your first name is Furkan. Furkan,
Yes.
right? Furkan. It's my bumper sticker is like I'm lucky to be alive. I've had a life full of doing so many difficult, dangerous things, and walking away from every single one of them, and that's really shaped a whole lot of my life. In the beginning, it led to me being more or less an adrenaline junkie, going from one wild ass thing after the other, whether it was climbing mountains or dodging bullets or in the middle of revolutions or whatever. And for the last half of my life, a bit more than half now, I guess I'm getting old. I really have turned that around, and there's a real story in that which we can get into. But it happened to start at a battle in Vietnam, where I began to realize that a life only oriented toward physical adventuring was a shallow life, and it wasn't worth living, and I had to do better. And so I began to
Mm.
crawl out of that self-centered hole and try to do some good things in the world, including working with Ann Medlock on the Giraffe Heroes Project, which has been the basis for most of my nonprofit work, my lecturing, my podcasts, everything else. So that's kind of in 30 seconds or less, we can spin off that.
Sure. I appreciate you sharing all that. I do want to understand those earlier experiences and what they were like, because to your point, it may be a bit self centered, but when you get close to death or have those near death experiences, for a lot of people, they've reported to say it does allow them to change the orientation of their life and start looking at life in a different way and try to then bring out more meaning. But what were those adventures like for you early on? What were you getting out of them that kept you going in that
Sure.
direction?
Yeah, I grew up in a very placid little American city, Tacoma, Washington. Nothing exciting ever happened there. Nothing exciting ever happened in my family. I was a classic nerd, constantly being bullied by bigger kids, and I hated it. And I was struggling to try to find my identity. I wanted to be a man. I look at movies with cowboy stars like John Wayne, and it seems so out of reach. And then some bully would steal my hat or something, and I just felt miserable. I loved my father, but he was a very extremely gentle man, and he was always getting pushed around and shoved aside for promotions at his work. And so he wasn't the model I was seeking. The whole thing shifted to an extraordinary series of events in which I found myself, barely 17 years old, shipping out on a freighter to the Far East. In those days, we're talking in late 50s, early 60s. Freighters weren't container ships. They didn't have containers then. They were just big ships with 60, 65 really tough guys running these ships and carrying the pirates kind of stuff. So I found myself on this ship and heading for the Far East. And let me tell you, those 60 guys took one look at me and they said, or thought, and they said, hey, we're going to teach you lessons you're never going to get in school, buddy. They did. And you can
Yeah.
imagine what some of those lessons were for a 17-year-old boy. And the very
Yeah.
first port of call was in the southern Philippines. And that night there was a huge brawl on the docks between my shipmates and the stevedores, the dock workers in this little village in the southern Philippines. And I got blind drunk, and my shipmates hauled me back to the freighter before I got beaten to a pulp. But oh my God, I never realized that. And for the rest of that trip, I finally understood who the real man was. The real men were people like this guy Roy, who was a 250-pound black guy that worked in the engine room, and nobody messed with Roy, and he was magnificent. Now, the very first couple of days on that ship, one of the other seamen came on to me sexually, and Roy took a look at that, grabbed this guy, shoved him up against the bulkhead, and there was this remarkable stream of cussing. Oh, it was magnificent for a guy like magnificent stream of cussing. And Roy beats the guy up and throws him down to the deck, and he says, "You son of a son, blank blank." Oh, I remember going down to where I was in my cabin, and looking into the mirror and trying to growl and cuss like Roy did, and trying to pretend that I was shoving people up against the wall and beating the shit out of them and stuff, because it was perfect. And I survived all that. And the very next summer, I was hitchhiking in Europe, and I realized that there was a war going on in Algeria, and I thought that would be really cool to get into a real shooting war. It was the colonial war between the rebels in Algeria and the French government. And so I hitchhiked down to Africa from Europe, and I went across from Morocco, and I stepped across the border. There wasn't any border guards because there was a war going on. And I found myself in Algeria. I was at least smart enough to put an American flag here on my chest so that the rebels wouldn't think I was French and shoot me. But I had a heck of a time roaming around Algeria in the middle of a colonial war. And again, I realized, hey, this is a lot of fun. And I guess I'm indestructible because I just kept moving through it. I spent a couple nights with French Foreign Legionnaires and also with the rebels, and I began to realize that these guys they were just like Roy. The French Foreign Legionnaires, for example, were big, tough guys. Most of them were criminals, because that's what the French Foreign Legion was. Guys that couldn't make it in Europe, they came down and fought for the French in Algeria. Then I was utterly hooked, and I wanted nothing more than my life would be like the French Foreign Legionnaires or Roy, the big black guy on that ship. And every movie I watched, every book I read was always about some tough guy, and I was determined to be tough myself. And I set about doing that. And the instant I got to college, I realized that I needed a better body than the way I had. So I turned out for crew, and I put on about 30 pounds of muscle in a year or two, rowing crew in Harvard. And all of a sudden, I did have a body, and I grew, and so I became big and tough and totally addicted to adrenaline rushes. Halfway through my college career, I joined up with 6 other members of the Harvard Mountaineering Club, and we climbed one of the most difficult and dangerous first ascents in North American mountain history, the north face of Mount McKinley. It was Mount McKinley then, and then Denali now. What the hell it is now? Back to Mount McKinley. But it was extremely dangerous. We almost got killed a half a dozen times with avalanches, rock falls, falling in crevasses. I kept walking away from all of it. We got back from that, and I was utterly determined that I was indestructible. So after college, I decided to take a year off, and I hitchhiked around the world, except for the oceans. Literally hitchhiked around the world, and I had a stringer. I had a job from the Boston Globe to report on every war I came across. So I got into the wars in those years. It was Cyprus and Somalia and Laos and the beginnings of the war in Vietnam. And I would write dispatches back to the Boston Globe, and they would pay me. And again, it was like I was indestructible and totally turned on by that. But then I realized at a certain point I wasn't rich, and I had to somehow make a living. And I tried to figure out how to do that. I could have almost made a career as a foreign correspondent, I think. I was doing rather well for the Boston Globe. But I ended up deciding to join the U.S. Foreign Service because I thought, hey, that's a really cool profession. I'll be respected and powerful, and I could get myself in all kinds of trouble. It'd be a lot of fun. And I did that, and I wasn't disappointed. I ended up, within a few years, I was in the middle of the revolution, the first revolution in Libya, when Gaddafi came to power, and I just loved it. I just loved it. The other people at the embassy were freaking out, looking at mobs in the streets and burning cars, and I was just saying, bring it on, man. I like this stuff. And then from then, after that, I told the State Department I wanted to be sent to Vietnam, but only if they'd send me to the most dangerous place they had, most dangerous assignment. And they did. They sent me to be advisor to the city of Hue, a city in the very north end of what was then South Vietnam, right up against what was then the demilitarized zone. Some of your listeners may remember it from the Tet Offensive. The Tet Massacre happened in Hue, and I was there a few years after that. So I was in the middle of the war in Vietnam for a year and a half, and it was everything I expected it to be. People were shooting at me. I was shooting back. I never wore a uniform. I was in that part of the war effort where you didn't wear a uniform, so I was doing some pretty nasty stuff, intelligence, counterintelligence. But there came, as I alluded to, first minute or so I was on, there came a time, a battle. The North Vietnamese, 2 years before they finally did overrun all of Vietnam, they tried and they came across from the north, aiming straight at Hue, and they all but surrounded the city. And the South Vietnamese troops, who were under terrible leadership and broke and ran basically, and the North Vietnamese troops were only 6 miles away from the city gates. I couldn't get out because a helicopter sent to rescue me and the other three American civilians there couldn't get in without being shot at by our own side. And oh, by the way, did I say that there were no American troops there? Because this was after the troop withdrawals, the American
Mm.
troop withdrawals had begun. So it was really just four of us civilians
Yeah.
facing the North Vietnamese army. And it looked pretty bleak. I didn't think we were going to get out of there. But at a certain point, when it looked absolutely awful, I realized that my job at that point was to recreate a martial law government in a way so that we could reestablish some law and order, or at least give the South Vietnamese a fighting chance. Because what was
Mm.
happening was that a whole lot of deserters from the South Vietnamese army were raping and looting and terrorizing the people of Hue, who then fled. It was an incredible scene. I still cannot forget seeing it, like in a horror movie. The artillery was banging away from both sides, sailing over my head. The people were screaming, glass was breaking, people were shouting, the marketplace was in flames, and it was like the first circle of hell. Anyway, I realized that I
Mm.
had to establish some order. So I go to the deputy mayor, who at least was brave enough not to have fled like the mayor had. And I said, look, we got to stop this looting. We got to stop these deserters. And the only way to do that, I think, is to set up a firing squad. So he agrees with me, and we set up a firing squad to shoot the deserters. And I realized that I didn't know if setting up a firing squad would do any good or not. And I did realize that the looters and deserters were all 19-year-old farm boys dragooned off their rice paddies, maybe just a month before, given minimal training, and thrust into the front lines. And they were terrified. They were scared out of their wits. So many of them got drunk and misbehaved and were causing the problem. But the firing squad, I thought, might do some good, but I didn't know for sure. And then at a certain point, I realized that here I was calling on this Vietnamese man, the mayor, to start shooting other Vietnamese so that they could get together and shoot still a third set of Vietnamese. And I knew the war was lost. I hated the war. It was stupid and unwinnable. I was only there because of the adrenaline rush. That's the only reason I was in Vietnam. And now my
Yeah.
selfish passion for adventure was going to cost some young men their lives before a firing squad. And I just felt, oh my God, what have I done with my life that it's come to this? How shallow. And I remember just almost crying, like putting my head down and just saying, oh my God. Anyway, obviously I survived, and that's only because the clouds parted the next morning and the fighter jets from American aircraft carriers flew over the city and bombed the hell out of the advancing North Vietnamese columns and tanks, and they retreated, and my life was saved yet again. and I got out of that, but it really did change my life. I came back to the U.S., went to California, and I didn't call it PTSD then, but I had a healthy dose of PTSD. I would walk on the shadow sides of the street in Palo Alto, California, to avoid sniper fire. I had terrible nightmares and whatever, but mostly it was trying to dig myself out of that self centered hole. I went to what were then called encounter groups in California, where you got together with other people and spilled your guts and tried to understand yourself, and that helped some. And I began to realize that I had a lot of work to do. I also began to realize that
Mhm.
there was a human being in me. I wasn't a monster. I was, in fact, a pretty gentle guy, a pretty compassionate guy. It's just that as a young man with all this adventuring, it was like I had nailed heavy a heavy wooden board over my heart, and I couldn't feel my heart
Mhm.
anymore. But all of a sudden, I ripped that board off, and I saw I did have a heart. I just had to find it. Took a long time for account. It took a long time because I was so deeply into this adrenaline rush. But I realized that I could be a better human being. I could be a father to my children. Other people could actually like me instead of me being just who I was. I was a very top-down leader, for example, but I was by the military. And I gradually began to pull out of that. There were backslidings, of course, but I ended up in the United Nations about 6, 7 years after that episode in California. And now my life really had turned around, and the UN was a great place
Mhm.
for me to exercise my heart. They put me in charge of American policies toward the third world, which is to say all the poor countries of Africa and Asia.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of good. I did a lot of good in fighting for peace and justice issues, constantly in trouble with my own government. Because right at that point, I mean, the U.S. was completely indifferent to the plight of the black and brown peoples of the world. They didn't give a damn, except for votes in the UN, because we were then in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. All we wanted was their votes. We didn't give a damn about them and their poverty and their diseases, but I did. And so I worked hard on peace and justice issues. And I'm proud to say that during that time, I did some stuff that really helped end apartheid in South Africa, something that I'm really proud of, like I said. And doing that, I really had to double cross my own government. We were doing nothing to end apartheid, which I don't know if all your listeners know, but apartheid was a system of racial oppression in South Africa. Just terrible. And the army and the police used guns and whips and everything else to keep the black people in line so that they could clean their swimming pools and sweep the streets and do all the menial jobs where the whites ran the country. And I went down to South Africa and I saw apartheid for myself. It was just awful. And I came back determined to end it, and I did. And I did that by finding out who was shipping guns to South Africa, because it was those guns and military equipment that were allowing the South African military and police to wreak so much havoc on the black population. So what I did was I
Yeah.
secretly found out who was responsible and who their protectors were in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government. It was a really sick, corrupt situation. There was a whole lot of money to be made in shipping guns to South Africa. So America looked the other way until I began working with the Black Africans in the Security Council. I gave them all kinds of secret information about how to turn the screws on my own government. I never forget once I got word of a telegram, a cable in those days, sent to my boss,
Yeah.
the American Secretary of State. It was from an African foreign minister, and it was complaining bitterly about American hypocrisy in not backing the installation of an arms embargo to turn off the spigot of guns to the white South African police. And in the middle of this message, I saw two sentences that I myself had drafted 3, 4 weeks before, handed them to my contact at the UN. He had sent them back to his boss in their capital, and they'd come rocketing back my words against the American Secretary of State. Anyway, at a certain point, I'd created enough pressure so that I could go to my own masters and say, look, we have to do something because we're looking like total hypocrites in the world. I finally convinced the American
Yeah.
government to bite the bullet, no pun intended, to back an arms embargo on South Africa. And as soon as they did that, the rest of the nation shipping guns to South Africa also had to stop. The embargo was instituted and it stopped the flow of guns, and in time that helped end apartheid. But boy, I tell you, I could have been fired or even put in jail at any point because I was then using all my risk-taking abilities. I was smart and tough, but I was also a great risk taker. So this now I was taking risks to do good in the world, and my life had totally
Mm.
changed. I talk way too much, and you haven't even
Yeah.
given you a chance to open your mouth. So anyway, that was the first part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's quite the story and quite the journey you've been on. And one of the things that's coming up for me is I am curious to understand, based on all the wars you've been able to experience firsthand and see with your own eyes, what comes to mind for you when you think about war now, especially in the modern world? Why are there still wars taking place, and what can people understand about war based on the experiences you've had?
That it's stupid, that most wars are unwinnable, that there are better ways to get there, and that just about every war I ever came across or was a part of was because of corruption, stupidity, and ignorance. And I guess that's not going to change. I'm looking at, of course, Gaza and looking at Ukraine. And the motivations for those wars weren't a lot different than America's role in Vietnam. We made a terrible mistake to go into Vietnam. I also think we made a terrible mistake, George Bush did, in going into starting the war in Iraq. And now you look at what's going on in the Ukraine and what the Russians are doing in their invasion of the Ukraine. And it's a real test case as to what the rest of the world is going to do. And now with Mr. Trump as president, God knows what's going to happen. It looked for a while that the rest of the world might get its act together and present a long-term opposition to Russia and Ukraine. Now I'm not so sure. Same way in Gaza, you've got Netanyahu who is totally enthralled to his right wing, and now it looks like their plan is to simply take over all of Gaza. It's human nature, and when you want to
Yeah.
get past that, you have to look at a lot deeper than just not shipping guns, for example, to the parties that are at war, and not being really smart in terms of the missiles you design or the planes you fly. You have to look at humans. You have to look at what's motivating humans to do this, to participate in this. And I've long figured out, at least that's my observation, that so much of it is people that are ignorant and scared, and they're afraid of some kind of personal loss, and they don't talk about that because they haven't found any meaning in their lives, and the only meaning they found in their lives is to kill other people. And yet I am convinced, after and I'm now 82 years old, that there's nothing more powerful than the human search for meaning. As a young man, I found meaning in adventure, and it was pretty damn shallow. Now I
Yeah.
found meaning basically in service and trying to make the world a better place. But I have plenty of friends and contacts who
Mm.
still find meaning in money and power. And they're the ones that are most susceptible to making the world a worse place, whether it's policies that are harmful to the poorest amongst us here in the United States or in Africa or Asia or in supporting wars around the world. Human beings
Yeah.
need to find meaning in their life, and they need to find it in something other than money and power. And that's where each one of
Yeah.
us can play a part, because we don't have to say, I'm
Yeah.
going over to Gaza and stopping the war. No, you just have to do, each one of us has got to do what we can do to make the world a better place, and
Absolutely.
to find that meaning in service in the areas where we can have an impact. As my wife says, you need to pick up the corner of the rug you can reach. And what she means by that is start where you have to start. Start with your own community. God knows in our communities, every single one of them has problems. Maybe it's low income housing, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's whatever it is where you live. But get active there. Don't put your head in the sand. Get active. Be of service. Make your community a better place, and then expand that. Expand that to your nation. get involved. I think what's going on now, quite frankly, with the Trump and Musk government is a real threat. And I'm not proposing armed revolution, but I am saying each one of us has got to counter some of the hypocrisy and violence and ignorance that's coming out of Washington, D.C. Standing up and telling the truth, standing up and collaring our own elected officials, whether we agree with them or not, standing up to join a group or join a demonstration or write letters. But after all, there are 320 million people in this country, and a very small portion of them are making things bad for the rest of us. We need to stand up
Mhm.
and do things. And it's all about each one of us finding the meaning in our life through making the world a better place. And if we mash together
Right.
and form a critical mass, we can make a difference. And it's been that way for hundreds of years. Whether it's Martin Luther King or some of the heroes in European history, it's been individual people and small groups of people that have changed things. It's almost always been that way. So I'm on a soapbox
Yeah.
now, but I really do think that things are so bad now in the United States that each individual cannot afford to keep their head in the sand. We got to do something. And it's not idle. It's not just, oh, I hope things will be better. No, not at all. You can't bring a knife to a gunfight. I know that. I've been in plenty of gunfights. You need to look at what needs fixing most, and that's right in each individual human soul, human character. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I definitely agree with you and appreciate that. And you touched on the Iraq War and Vietnam, and one can make the case that hindsight now you can look back and say, yes, those were poor decisions. But and then you touch on the apartheid in South Africa. I've covered that on this podcast too, in terms of what it was all about. But I see so many parallels between the apartheid and what's going on in Gaza, as you've touched on it. And Gaza is definitely close to my heart because of what I see the people going through. But I also see such a divide amongst the people. There's such polarizing views where people are falling on either side, and no one can seem to come to an agreement. Why are we not able to see it that way? Like, why is there this other side that thinks that Israel has a right to defend itself and it continues to bomb civilians with that justification? Why is it so hard for people to see those similarities that we saw in South Africa? Perhaps some of the decisions we saw the United States make when it was related to the Iraq War and the Vietnam War. So, where are people falling? Because you're talking about perhaps the people in power and their greed, but what about the general population?
We were so close, Furkan. I've been involved in Middle East peace efforts for 25 years. And my efforts, by the way, got me put on George Bush's no-fly list, where I was deemed a threat to national security. Because in order to do my work as a peace builder in the Middle East, I had to know what both sides were thinking, not just the Israelis. They were quick to tell me their side. I needed to know what was happening in Palestine. So I went down for once, for example, to talk to the Hamas leaders in a refugee camp in southern Lebanon. The French security services picked me up, and I got hauled into a small windowless room at the French airport on my way home. They finally let me go. I thought I was okay, but then 2 weeks later, I was flying down to California, and I was stopped at the airport and given a letter from, it just said from the government. It was all, and it said basically, you're on the no-fly list. That means that you have to get special permissions to fly, and you're a threat to national security, and you'll never be taken off this list. So I've been on that list ever since. Anyway, the point being, I got put on that list because of my efforts to find peace in the Middle East. And I can tell you that in the late 1990s, we were almost there. The solution in 1998, 2000, whatever, was friggin' obvious. There was a two-state solution back when there was enough of land for the Palestinians to make a two-state solution really viable. And they were the right leaders, Rabin and even Yasser Arafat. And we came
Yeah.
so close with the Oslo Accords, and I was part of that. We came so close to that, and it wasn't a stroke of political genius. It was just a two-state solution. You draw a friggin' line down, and you're intelligent on where you draw the line. I remember a lot of the negotiations were secret, and I was in Switzerland, and I and an Israeli lieutenant colonel hiked up to a restaurant up on a mountain and rolled out a bunch of maps to draw the line between the two states. And we argued, of course, back and forth and back and forth. But there we were drawing the line, and it wasn't that hard. You had to draw a line that permitted the Palestinians to farm their fields, to take their to market their crops. There had to be easy access back and forth so that those Palestinians working in Israel could go there and come back in the evening. It wasn't rocket science, but it all got turned on its head. And in this case, I have to say that the fault was clearly on both sides because the Palestinians basically rejected that, and it was the best offer that they were ever presented with. And it was a tragedy because things never got better from that. And Israel slid into an oligarchy and came up with people like Netanyahu. And the settlers then began to experience a lot more freedom in breaking across the existing ceasefire lines and establishing settlements on what was supposed to be Palestinian land. And the Netanyahu government didn't stop them. And these people were, I'm sorry, they were real fascists. They still are. I have no sympathy whatsoever for the right wing Israelis. I don't have any sympathy for Hamas either, don't get me wrong, but I don't have any
Right.
sympathy at all for Israelis, the Israel right wing. They're a huge part of the problem. And now, I don't know, there's hardly enough land to even think about a two-state solution. But if you don't do that, then you're left with an apartheid solution. You're left with one hunk of land, and the Israelis aren't about to share political power, especially since demographics indicate that the Arabs are going to outbreed them in another generation or two. So you're going to have the only solution for the Israelis is an apartheid solution, and we know what happened there. We're talking about
Yeah.
one intifada after the other. We're talking about full-scale civil war, which in these days shows every possibility of turning into a global nuclear war. Israel has the bomb. Iran basically has the bomb. That's where we're headed. So there has to be some kind of peace. And now I'm thinking that the only way to do that is to do what happened in Cyprus with another totally intractable conflict between Greeks and Turks over where to split the island so that the Greek and Turkish communities could each have a certain degree of independence, but not be constantly fighting and killing each other. And the only solution was to have a strong UN peacekeeping force. And that's probably what's going to be necessary. There's going to have to be, after a ceasefire, there's going to have to be a strong multilateral presence dividing the two sides. And it's going to have to be armed. It'll piss a lot of Israelis off. It'll piss a lot of Palestinians off. And of course, in this case, you've got Gaza on one side and you've got the West Bank on the other, so it becomes even more difficult. But there's going to have to be, I suspect, an outside peacekeeping force and a reconstruction force to rebuild what's left of Gaza. It's going to have, and it's going to have to be there on an almost permanent basis, which means that
Yeah.
there will never be a real peace, but at least possibly we might avoid what's happened over the last year and a half or so, with so many people killed. Yeah. And the other thing is that one of the parts of the problem is that the two sides have to get rid of their current governments. Netanyahu cannot be allowed to have any role in Israeli politics. They should put him in jail and turn off the settler right wing. And because there are plenty, and I know them, I work with them. There are plenty of really well-intentioned Israeli politicians who are patriots, but at the same time they understand the truth of kind of like I'm talking now. On the other hand, the Palestinians have got to get rid of Hamas once and for all. Hamas can never again have a political role in Israel Palestine. And then also, there are also plenty of good Palestinians who understand perfectly well how to run a country given the chance and who would be willing to work out the details if only the extremists on both sides would permit it. So that's where we are. It's a difficult situation. The solution has got to be in the short term and probably the long term. It's got to be put in place and held in place by some kind of tough multilateral force. And then Israelis and Palestinians have got to begin the long seemingly sometimes impossible task of healing. In the 1990s,
Yeah.
it was there. We'd meet in places like
Yeah.
Switzerland, I talked about earlier, and half the people coming to these sessions were Palestinians and half were Israelis, and they were talking to each other. And in those days, Palestinians had Israeli friends, Israelis had Palestinian friends, and there was a real chance of the two sides getting together. After all, as everybody knows,
Yeah.
the Palestinians and the Israelis are basically first cousins. It's a Semitic population.
Yeah.
And it'll take a long time now because I'm in pretty constant contact, even now, by any means of communication I can get. And the degree of hate and fear is so much worse now than it was in 1998. So much worse. I can
Yeah.
still hear a rabbi in Tel Aviv say, I worked my whole life for peace. I worked my whole life for peace, John. He said, but on October 7th, the day after the massacre by Hamas, some of the people I regarded as my Arab friends were dancing in the street, and it just was too much. I just wept. It's going to be really difficult, and it's going to take decades, and mostly it's going to take leadership. If we don't do that, obviously there's going to be a whole lot more people killed, but more to the point for the rest of the world, it's going to be the most likely source of World War III, of a nuclear war started in the Middle East.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because what I'm hearing from you is you can sympathize with both sides, right? Both arguments, because there's been wrong that's been done on both sides. Now, I am curious to understand, just more out of personal curiosity too, because based on my understanding, you referenced the Oslo Accords as well, but one of the arguments the Palestinians were making through various negotiations, that they would sign these deals and agreements with the Israeli side, but then the Israelis wouldn't follow through on the agreements. Is there any truth to that based on what you've observed and your understanding, or is that just Palestinians stating
No,
that?
I think but I also think it's true for them too. They busted out of nowhere to attack Israel on October 7th, a year and a half ago. And the Israelis, hell, they broke the ceasefire, didn't they? Just 2 weeks ago. So, yeah,
Yeah.
and like I say, the only way to do that is not to rely on the good graces or the good faith of either side. It's way past that. It's too late for that. There has to be a tough, strong armed multilateral force, probably made up mostly of Muslim nations, but not entirely. Might be some Canadians involved, for example. But there's got to be a multilateral force with real teeth. And so they will be responsible for disarming extremists
Yes.
from either side, and they may have to be there for decades. In Cyprus, for example, the war in Cyprus was nominally ended 50 years ago. There are still UN troops on Cyprus.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I do want to understand from your kind of personal side of things, like you did touch on the fact that you had a lot of these experiences where, again, difficult experiences, almost died in terms of the just the risk involved, high risk. How were you able to reconcile for yourself that at times you were speaking up against your own government? How were you able to do that? Because there's that whistleblowing aspect there. And why do you think they didn't get rid of you just to get you out of the
Yeah,
way?
the latter point, I don't know. But I was also extremely smart. I think I still am. I don't think I've lost it. But I didn't go down in the middle of the street in the UN and say, hey, watch me double cross my own government. No, I did this in quietly in little restaurants 3 blocks off the main UN campus and quiet meetings and all kinds of stuff. And this wasn't the only time I did it. It's another whole story, but I came within a whisker of getting the American hostages out of Tehran when the Ayatollah Khamenei took 53 Americans hostage. I worked with the Cuban government to almost put together a deal that got them freed. And I wasn't even supposed to talk to the Cubans. Our relationships were that bad. But I loved the Cubans. We were both baseball nuts. We would get together and we would talk politics, sure, but we'd also argue about the collapse of the Red Sox pitching that year or whatever. And they were great. And some of my best friends at the UN were Cubans. And we put together a deal in a workers' restaurant in Belgrade. We were all there for a conference, and the Cubans took me out to this restaurant on the other side of the tracks, and we had rice and beans and way too much red wine. And somewhere around midnight, someone got out the proverbial napkin, and we sketched out a deal where Fidel Castro would act as the intermediary to get the American hostages out, and on the other side, the Americans would lift all, or at least the major, of the economic sanctions against Cuba. That was the trade off. Turned out that Castro was eager to do it. And so I came back to my own government and I said, hey, I just put together this deal where Castro will talk to Ayatollah Khomeini and we'll get our hostages out. What do you think about that? Oh, man, did I get beat up? No way we're going to give Castro the credit for anything. You tell those sons of bitches, no, we're not going to take the offer. And by the way, Graham, you're really lucky you're not in jail or we haven't fired you. I took a lot of chances to do what I had to do. And I still do. As I do a lot of podcasting, right? And I do also have a TikTok series for young people called Badass Granddad. I urge your listeners to dial
Okay.
into it. Badass, all one word, Granddad with two D's. Just go into TikTok. And in that, I say in every episode, and most of it's 3 minutes long, about a minute and a half, 2 minutes is one of my crazy ass adventure stories. But then there's a life lesson attached to it on perseverance, courage, whatever, and a call to action. And it's been remarkably powerful. That's only been going 5 months. I've already got close to 150,000 viewers, and the comments are just wonderful. I'm really enjoying it. I think I'm being of real service. But one thing I always say is look, living a life without taking risk is boring and ultimately inconsequential. That's a pretty strong statement. I'm basically saying that life isn't worth it unless you start taking some risks.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point earlier, the risk doesn't have to be that grand. It doesn't have to be huge. You can start small, right? You can start in your own home. You can start in your community and then see how that grows. But I agree with you. I think we have become so comfortable in our current technological world that we're not willing to take risks and learn from those experiences because then you learn what you're capable of. And there's something profound in that.
Yes, yes, there is. And also, there's another angle to that, too. I do a lot of talking to business audiences because there's a lot of risk takers out there, entrepreneurs, for example. And I do the same thing I do with them in a way as I do for the young people on TikTok. I tell stories of my adventures, and then if they give me 45 minutes, tell those stories of wars and climbing mountains for 35 minutes, and then I'll pivot to how my life changed and what I'm doing now, and then I'll end by saying, "Hey, we can all do this." And I'm not Mr. Businessman, Miss Businessman, entrepreneurs. I'm not talking about becoming Mother Teresa. God, no. I'm not talking about
Yeah.
sackcloth and ashes. You can be of service anywhere. You can be of service and stay in business. I'm not saying leave your job because you can be in business and making a good product, selling it at a fair price,
Yeah.
under fair labor conditions, under fair environmental conditions, and with a strong eye towards supporting the communities in which you work. That's a service. That's a service. So
Yeah.
you can find service any
Abs-
place. And you don't have to be a nonprofit person to do that by any means. You can be any age, you can be any
Yeah.
color in the rainbow. And that, by the way, we talked earlier a little bit about the Giraffe Project. The Giraffe Project honors
Yes.
people who stick their necks out, and we tell their stories. These are brave and compassionate people who see a problem around them and they go tackle it because they know that if they don't tackle it, nobody else will. So the problem could be a whistleblowing type problem. It could be poverty. It could be disease. It could be politics. It could be all kinds of stuff, corruption, environmental damage, whatever. And we find these people and tell their stories, and they're all taking risks, and they're every
Yeah.
color in the rainbow. And of course, they're men and they're women, and there's even some kids involved, all doing stuff to make their world a better place. And they are great examples.
Yeah.
And we've been doing this now for 42, 43 years now. We've been finding these people. In the beginning, we were telling their stories on vinyl records. I don't know if any of you listening to this knows what a vinyl record is, but it goes round and round on a turntable, makes noise comes out.
Yeah.
We started with vinyl records and press releases. Now, of course, we use the latest in social media. But anyone can dial in at giraffe.org and see what we're doing. And it's been remarkably successful. We are doing what people have done for 10,000 years. If any culture anywhere, I don't know, beginning with Neanderthals maybe, if any culture wanted to make its own people heroic, it didn't do that by preaching at them. It did it by example. It did it by telling stories of people already acting heroically. And it's always been that case. That's why the troubadours of the Middle Ages were so important. They told the stories of heroes and in that way made other people heroic. That's what the Giraffe Project's doing now, the Giraffe Heroes Project. We've told the stories now of almost 2,000 people over 42 years. And in doing
Yeah.
so, we've inspired, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions, whatever, people to become heroic themselves. And that's our very simple minded message, but it's a powerful message and it works. And so I'm happy
Yes.
to spend the rest of my days working for the Giraffe Project. And that's what I do. Yeah, I do podcasts. I've written 5 books. Yeah, I've got this TikTok thing going that I'm really enjoying because it makes me feel young again. I'm 82, and most of my viewers are like 22. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's cool. I thought, this is an aside. I thought, oh, I'll start this and I'm going to get a lot of snarky brickbats from all these young people. Well, who the hell does old fart think he is? Oh,
Yeah.
no, I haven't got a single negative comment and no snark at all. I've gotten a lot of positive comments, and half of the positive comments are keep it up, like your stories. But the other half are questions and comments about young people actively searching to put more meaning in their lives because they're just starting out. They're out of college for a year or two. They're in their first job, their marriage or whatever, and they listen to my stories and they will ask honest, heartfelt questions. But when you're really scared, what do you do? And what do you do if your best friend won't
Yeah.
follow you? And what do you do? What do you do? And so I spend maybe 4 or 5 hours a week, if I may say so, answering my fan mail from TikTok just because I want to be of service to these young people. I want to try and impart some of the stuff I've learned over 82 years. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's so important to do that because I feel for the younger generation because everything around them is telling them there's no meaning to life. And it's so important to have that. And like you said earlier, I think this is a very important point why a lot of these stories from the Middle Ages have survived the test of time because there is a meaning in those stories of these people who did stick out their necks in the past and why we feel so inspired by their stories. And for you to be here and sharing yours, I think a lot of people are finding that inspiration to hear what you've been through and why you're doing the work you're doing, especially with the Giraffe Project
yeah. And with the
and
giraffe, with the
even in
giraffes,
the East.
the nice thing about the giraffes, it isn't just me. Like 2,000 giraffes, I got 2,000 stories to tell. 2,000. So I'll never run out of stories. And not only that, but
Yeah,
it just makes my life so. I hope I come across to these young people as being excited and passionate about what I do. And so maybe they might think, hey, the guy's 82 years old. He's got more energy than I do. What's going on with that guy? Oh, he tells me what's going on. He's got some meaning in his life and it really is turning him on. Yeah, okay, I get that. I think I get that. So I'm
yeah,
having a lot of
yeah,
fun with that. And it isn't that it's all a steady upward. There's always real challenges and plenty of chances to backslide. I might just how much time do we have? I want to tell a story that's going to take about 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Can I do that?
yeah. Go for it.
Okay.
Of course.
I'm at the UN, right? And I've helped end apartheid. But then I have to quit because not only have I been discovered by my masters in Washington, they don't like me much anymore, but I'm also aware that what I want to do with my life, I simply can't take orders from anyone. And there's no way that I can take orders from people who with small minds and small thoughts. So I quit. And I start figuring, oh, I've always been a good speaker and writer. I'll start giving speeches. And it's the middle of the Cold War, so I'll join the peace movement and I'll start giving speeches. And everyone will love my speeches and I'll become famous and whatever. Ha, didn't work. because you can't get people to change their behavior by preaching at them. I didn't realize that. And so I was going broke fast. And a friend comes up to me and he says, "Hey, you're going broke fast, right? No one's coming to your lectures. What? Why don't you try to lecture on cruise ships?" I said, "What?" "Yeah, cruise ships, they hire guest lecturers. They pay them really well." And so the first try, I get a job on a cruise ship sailing from Vancouver, British Columbia to the Far East and back. And I get to take someone with me. I take my then 13-year-old daughter, Mallory, and we head off on this cruise ship. And after 3 days, we're out in the middle of the North Pacific, and that damn ship catches fire. It catches fire. And they lie to us so that we're all told to come up to the ship's lounge where they're going to blow smoke out of the bowels of the ship, but the fire's been put out. Don't worry, etc. Free drinks being served. Then we're all taken to the fantail, the rear of the ship, where we're given more free drinks, but the smoke's getting blacker and thicker. Any fool can see that the fire's not out. And so they bring out the ship's orchestra. I'm not kidding. Decades later, I took Mallory to watch Titanic when the movie came out, and there were so many parallels. It was ridiculous. Anyway, so we're there and then at a certain point, this is now about 2, 3 in the morning, and we're told to go to our lifeboat stations. Now, at that moment, the sea is pretty calm, but we've been told that the evening before that a typhoon's coming on, Typhoon Vernon. So we know a typhoon's coming on, the weather's going to get worse. We're all up by our lifeboat stations. The captain comes out on the deck and he says we have to abandon the ship because they can't get the fire out. And at that moment, the fire burns through the last of the retaining walls and glass windows in the lounge and the dining room, and sheets of flame 30 feet high leap into the sky, and people are really freaking out. There's about 550 people. Not a big cruise ship by today's standards, but 550 people are freaking out. And you can't jump into the water because this is the Gulf of Alaska. It's November, October. You die in 5 minutes because of the cold. So the captain goes out on
Yeah.
again and tries to reassure people, and we all get into lifeboats, and the lifeboats get lowered and drift away from the burning ship. And the rescue starts at dawn. Helicopters have to fly 140 miles or so from bases on the mainland, and a big tanker has also answered the SOS, and by dawn has come in sight. But the tanker is so big it can't maneuver to the lifeboats. So what they have to do is the helicopters have to fly over each lifeboat, lower a metal chair on the end of a chain, pick up one person, get 7 or 8 people in the helicopter, fly them to the deck of the tanker, drop them off, come back for 7 or 8 more. They work as fast as they can, but the typhoon's coming on, right? So I watched my daughter Mallory rescued. And about 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the helicopter pilot signals that he can't come back because we're now in the middle of a full blown typhoon, and it's suicide for helicopters to try to rescue people from lifeboats in that kind of weather. Our only chance is a Coast Guard cutter, small ship. There are two of them searching for us like needle in a haystack. The key thing, though, is the fading light because even in a storm before the sun sets, we have no lights, no flares, no radio. We're all dying of the cold. I've been mountain climbing enough to know what hypothermia looks like. We're all dying of hypothermia. And we have maybe 5, 6 hours to live. And the Coast Guard cutters are doing their best to find us, crisscrossing this wild ocean. The waves get higher and higher. We're finally at about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. We're in 30-foot seas. That's like being in seas where you're facing a wall of water 6 stories high, 30-foot waves. And like I say, we're all dying of hypothermia. And so at that point, there's only 8 of us left in this lifeboat. Everybody else has been rescued. So I'm there with 7 other guys. And I'm looking around and I realize the hypothermia is setting in me and that I won't be alive in the morning unless they find us. But it's hard enough to find us during day. But once it's dark, which is going to be in less than an hour, our fates are really sealed. They'll never find us
Yeah.
because there's no lights, no nothing. So I'm sitting there
Yeah.
thinking, hey, looking back in my life, I've walked away from every one of the crazy ass near misses that I've had in my life. And I thought this time would be like that. But boy, the odds now are like 1 in a million. I may not be walking away from this one. But wait a minute, that's not right. because I helped end apartheid. I was doing good stuff at the United Nations. I turned my life around after that battle in Vietnam. And so I tried to pray, but I wasn't a religious person, but I was there shouting at God, saying, hey, I don't get it. You're wiping me out now just as I get going. I'm going to make the world a better place. You remember apartheid? I did that. And I can do a lot more stuff, but wiping me out now makes no sense at all. And I went to a Jesuit high school. I knew about order in the universe, the structure of crystals and stuff, all that order. This is not order at all. This is random chaos. You're wiping me out, and I don't like it, and it's not fair. I screamed at God. Another message came back. The other 7 guys, of course, didn't hear a thing. But to me, it was like voice coming out of a string of loudspeakers around my head. And basically, the voice in so many words said, stop kidding me. Stop kidding yourself. It's time for you to shit or get off the pot. God said to me, the voice said to me, stop kidding me. You get out of this. It's copacetic. You lecture on another cruise ship and then another one after that. Yeah, I know you helped end apartheid, but you got to show some real commitment to this life change. I don't see that. You got a choice. You can either keep lecturing on cruise ships or think you can, and you might as well die out here because the rest of your life won't be worth living. Or you can recommit yourself to the sense of service you felt at the United Nations, devoting your life to making the world a better place, to solving big, tough problems using your skills and resources. What'll it be? And I remember looking up into this wild storm and just saying, yes, okay, I'm beaten. I got it. And in that instant, this Coast Guard cutter, it was called the Bout, came crashing through this wild storm. It would have cut us in two had the lookout not seen us. And of course, I got rescued and back in New York. I never looked back on that. I kept my word. And I've done so ever since. That was in 1980, so a long time ago. And I've kept my word, and it's been important. And my lesson when I relate this story, and I tell it quite often, especially to skeptical audiences, I tell this quite often, and I'm quick to say, I do not expect you will have to ever fight for your life on a lifeboat in a typhoon in the North Pacific. However, every single one of us either has or will encounter something really difficult in our lives, maybe even a bit dangerous. And you're going to encounter that, and you need to be ready for that. And you need to be sure of your values, and you need to be sure of your character, and you need to be sure of what's meaningful in your life, and hold on to that. Otherwise, if you give up, like God said to me, your life may not be worth living. I urge people to not to think of me in the lifeboat, but to think of the next challenge. It might be a business challenge, for example, where it's either no one's blowing the whistle on a corrupt practice that's ruining the company, but they know, and maybe they're the one to blow the whistle and take that risk. Do it, do it, because that's what you're
Yeah.
here to do.
Right.
And by that point, having listened to my adventure stories, the cynics are quieted. And even the most hardcore cynics have put down their pencils or their phones and they're looking at me like, oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, okay. And I get a lot of positive feedback because that's basically my message. Live a life. Nothing's more important than a life lived with meaning. The key source of meaning is some kind of service. Could be as a businessman, could be as a nonprofit leader, could be as a neurosurgeon, could be as anything. Now then go for it. That's what life's about.
Yeah. Yes. No, and I appreciate that. And I was going to ask you what words of advice you would have for people like myself or the listeners, especially in a world where it's so much easier to turn a blind eye to things and live in the comfort of our homes and not take on those risks or speak up against things that you know are to be wrong. But I think your story encapsulates that in so many ways that we do all have that opportunity where for whether or not people believe in this or not, but God is speaking to us through these opportunities that come our way. And we have a choice to step up and do something and find meaning or walk away. And that message tends to get louder and louder until we do. So I appreciate you sharing that, Ray, because that does answer my question.
Yeah, and I try to keep, I don't mention the word God very much because I'm not particularly a religious person. And I don't think you have to use the word God. I think it's just the way that we're put on this planet. And we look around, and what's important is finding meaning. What is it? Is it power? Really? Is it money? Really? Okay. Maybe it's loving your grandchild. That's meaningful. Okay, let's go there. So you start small. You start with loving your grandchild. You start with looking at a small community issue where everyone else is talking about it, but no one's doing anything. Could be the failures to clean up a polluted stream, for example, or the piss poor efforts being made to provide low income housing. Could be anything. Could be anything. But maybe it's up to you to do it or to form the team that does it.
Yes, I agree. Thank you much, John, for your time today, sharing so much wisdom. I think it's important, and I can understand why all these young people on TikTok are being inspired by you, because there's so much wisdom in your, not only your adventures and your stories, and even when you're not looking for adventure. So, and you be here on this side and be able to hear everything firsthand. Uh, so this was an experience for me, and thank you so much. I'm so appreciative. Now, for listeners that want to learn more about your work with the Giraffe Heroes Project, or even just check out your videos on TikTok, I know you talked about it earlier. What are some ways they can do that, and how can they find you?
My website is, what is my website?
Giraffe or G?
JohnGraham.com. JohnGraham.com. Yeah. JohnGraham.org.
Right,
Sorry.
okay.
JohnGraham.org is my website. www.johngraham.org. The Giraffe website has an enormous amount of stuff on it, and giraffe stories, as well as more stuff on my own biography. If you're really looking into it, you can get my memoir off Amazon. It's called Quest, Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning. You can turn on TikTok and look for Badass Granddad. It's great fun. It's only 3 minutes. So, yeah, and I welcome comments. And my email, and I'll say that, is graham@giraffe.org. I would welcome comments from listeners because my whole aim is to talk to people and to try to help them through some of these difficult issues around fear and courage and meaning and service.
Yes, I appreciate all of that. Thank you so much, John. We'll share all of that in the show notes, and hopefully listeners do reach out to you and learn more.
Thank you. And thank you so much for doing this. I think this is a great show and a great service that you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.